Counter-terror police investigate a deadly taxi explosion outside Liverpool Womens Hospital. It happened just before 11 o'clock this morning. One person was killed. The driver is seriously injured.
Given how it has happened and out of caution, counter-terrorism police are leading the investigation.
Also tonight, Prince Charles takes the lead at the cenotaph as the Queen is kept away from the Remembrance Service with a bad back. The Prime Minister defends the climate deal struck at the summit in Glasgow. And prepare for High Speed 2.0. The government's expected to scrap the route from Birmingham to Leeds.
This is ITV News with Lucrezia Millarini.
Good evening. Counter-terror police are investigating after one person died and another was seriously injured following a car explosion outside Liverpool Women's Hospital. It happened just before 11 o'clock this morning as the car, a taxi, pulled up outside the hospital. Merseyside police say they are keeping an open mind as to what caused the explosion, but have not ruled out terrorism. We'll be live in Liverpool after our first report from Dan Rivers, which begins with footage shot in the aftermath of the explosion.
Oh my God, look at his head.
As the nation was about to pause and remember, this was the scene outside the Liverpool Women's Hospital. Onlookers clearly in shock at the fire engulfing a taxi where one person died and a second was seriously injured. It's not clear what caused the explosion, but army bomb disposal experts were called in. The police are unsure what happened, but terrorism has not been ruled out.
We are keeping an open mind as to what caused the explosion, but given how it has happened and out of caution, counter-terrorism police are leading the investigation, supported by Merseyside police.
The fire was brought under control and appears not to have spread to the hospital building. The remains of the burnt-out taxi left in place as forensic investigations get underway.
We responded with 2 fire appliances with a senior officer in attendance to a fully developed fire. The operational crews extinguished the fire rapidly, but as has been reiterated by the police chief constable, there was unfortunately one fatality. Another individual has left the vehicle prior to the fire developing to the extent that it did.
The hospital, the biggest of its kind dedicated to women's health in Europe, remains open, but access is now restricted with much of the scene still cordoned off. Dan Rivers, ITV News.
Well, our North of England reporter Hannah Miller is at the hospital. Hannah, what more can you tell us about what happened?
Well, police have declared this a major incident. We are aware of a number of searches by armed police going on across the city of Liverpool tonight, though police have not confirmed whether or not those are connected specifically to this incident. There is still a large police presence here at the hospital. The cordon behind me has just been extended. Staff are being escorted in and out of the hospital, and ambulances are coming here still for emergencies, but patients with other conditions are being redirected elsewhere. That it is causing an amount of disruption here tonight. Counter police say they're working rapidly to try and establish what had happened, but I think we can expect to see disruption here for quite some time.
All right, Hannah in Liverpool, thank you. The Queen was forced to pull out of her first public appearance for weeks today with a new health problem. She had been due to watch the Remembrance Service at the cenotaph, but withdrew this morning with a bad back. Buckingham Palace insisted her latest setback was unrelated to the issue, which led her to spend a night in hospital last month. And tonight, the Prime Minister said she had been very well when he saw her last week. Well, our royal editor, Chris Shipp, has the details.
For the last 4 years, the Prince of Wales has taken his mother's place at the cenotaph, but the Queen has still viewed the service from the balconies above. Today, though, there was a missing figure at the spot where the Queen was supposed to stand. Her cousins, the Duke of Kent and Princess Alexandra, stood without her. Below, Prince Charles looked particularly sombre after he laid the Queen's wreath on her behalf. Less than 2 hours earlier, Buckingham Palace announced the Queen had sprained her back and, with great regret, had been forced to cancel.
Somebody of advancing years, I certainly wouldn't recommend standing for any period of time or sitting for a long period of time, and certainly not standing around in the cold.
Royal sources said the back sprain was not related to her doctor's recent advice to rest, which had already forced her to cancel her attendance at the COP26 summit, where she had to record a video message instead. But it was her firm intention to be at the Remembrance Sunday service today. Even during last year's COVID restrictions, she still managed to pay her respects, like here at the grave of the unknown warrior.
She would wish to lead the nation, paying tribute to all the soldiers and all the armed forces who died. But also, I think, because she wouldn't wish her absence in any way to detract from this extremely important ceremony, which respects all those soldiers and which is such an important part of national life.
The Queen regards this service, said a palace aide today, as one of the most significant engagements of the year. No one would regret her absence more than the Queen herself. Chris Ship, ITV News.
Well, the Queen made it clear that she did not want her absence from the cenotaph to detract from today's remembrance events. Although she couldn't attend, thousands of others were able to take part for the first time in 2 years. COVID restrictions kept them away last year, and as Martha Fairley reports, it made today's events around the country even more poignant. Oh, apologies, we seem to be having some problems with that report. Let's go to our next story for the moment. And the Prime Minister has been defending the climate change deal agreed at the close of talks in Glasgow. Boris Johnson told journalists at a Downing Street press conference tonight that although the deal was game-changing, there was still a long journey ahead of us. Our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks, was there. So, Romilly, what did he mean by that exactly?
Well, it's unusual for Boris Johnson to give a press conference on a Sunday, but he clearly wanted to sprinkle some of his optimism over the deal struck in Glasgow, describing it as a game changer, as you say. Also, a historic agreement that gives the world a clear roadmap to limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees, that overarching goal of COP. He did express disappointment, though, that felt by many countries of the watering down of the language on coal, and he can't escape the bald facts that on current pledges, the world is still on course for increases of over 2 degrees, which for the most climate vulnerable countries, for island nations, is the difference between survival or not, which is why perhaps in his answer to me, he did emphasise that there's much more work to be done.
Romilly, I think it's still very, very difficult. It's still a massive challenge for humanity. As I've told you before, Romilly, I think that the fatal mistake now coming out of COP26, which has unquestionably been a success, the fatal mistake now would be to think that we've in any way cracked this thing.
Alok Sharma, the president of COP, who was also at that press conference, gave a fascinating insight into the last tense hour of negotiations yesterday, saying that he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders because the deal was really in jeopardy, which is a pretty sobering thought that there might not have been a deal at all.
All right, Romilly, thank you. Other news now, Poland has asked NATO to step in and resolve the migrant crisis on its border with Belarus. Poland accused Belarus of destroying a barrier to allow people to cross. Well, this afternoon, the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, said the UK recognises Russia is helping to destabilise Poland. More than 1 million 12 to 15-year-olds in England have now been vaccinated against COVID-19. NHS England said more than 3,500 schools have already hosted clinics, with 800 more set to be visited by NHS teams next week. The government has promised £50 million for research into new treatments for motor neuron disease. The Prime Minister said the funding would turbocharge the search for new therapies and drugs to help improve the life chances of those diagnosed with the illness. ITV News understands that a large stretch of the HS2 rail line between Birmingham and Leeds will no longer be built. Instead, the government is to spend money on other lines in the Midlands and Northern England. The plans will be formally announced later this week, as Sam Holder explains.
HS2 was supposed to be all about linking the northern powerhouse to the south. But although parts are already being built, it seems like the government is changing direction. Literally. ITV News understands much of the eastern leg, which connects Leeds and the northeast to Birmingham, will not be completed.
I think it's really worrying that HS2, which has been a long-standing commitment from this government, is under threat. Even if we do get sections in the north, sections in the Midlands, that big gap in the middle is going to lead to real losses in terms of the benefits of the wider project.
Around a third of the entire project is being scrapped. Instead, £100 billion will be spent on developing quicker links, including Birmingham to Nottingham, Leeds to Sheffield and Crewe to Manchester. The government is promising its new Red Wall voters a northern rail network to rival the south. Train journeys across the Midlands and the north can be painfully slow. Nottingham to Birmingham takes 72 minutes, even though they're only 50 miles apart. And the quickest journey from Leeds to Sheffield is 40 minutes, twice as long as it takes to get from London to Reading, even though they're pretty much the same distance apart. For Stop HS2 campaigners, the plans are bittersweet. Some towns will be saved from the diggers. Others are likely to be on the new routes, like Crofton, between Sheffield and Leeds.
If the eastern route and the eastern leg is cancelled, this will be a great victory for the Yorkshire people. Obviously, for communities like ours and others in West Yorkshire, we've still got the impacts and none of the benefits.
The controversial project is a key stop on the government's route towards levelling up the north. But with HS2 still apparently full steam ahead for Manchester and the northwest, the government may end up making some parts feel less level than others. Sam Holder, ITV News, West Yorkshire.
Bit of sport. Australia have won cricket's 2020 World Cup. They beat New Zealand by 8 wickets in the final in Dubai with 7 balls to spare. And let's finish by returning to today's Remembrance events. As we mentioned earlier, thousands of people were able to take part for the first time in 2 years after COVID restrictions kept them away 12 months ago. And as Martha Fairley reports, it made today's events around the country even more poignant.
At the sound of the last post, they fell silent across the country. A national act of remembrance for those who made the ultimate sacrifice. And in Whitehall, the site of 10,000 serving personnel and veterans on parade after last year's ceremony was scaled back. At 95, this is the first time D-Day veteran Henry Rice has marched past the cenotaph.
I've always wanted to do it, to be truthful with you, and today, with the spirit of Normandy, I've managed to join in with all these wonderful men.
But there are now many far younger veterans, like those who served in Afghanistan, where British operations ended earlier this year as the country fell to the Taliban.
And it's important that we continue to remember those that have gone before us in other greater wars, but also those who have lost their life in more recent conflicts as well.
And for the first time, the official recognition of LGBT plus veterans in the parade.
It's the visibility to show people, look, the armed forces has always been diverse. It might not have always been inclusive, but it's always had that diversity in there.
In its centenary year, the Royal British Legion's asking the next generation to remember, like Eliza, who's just learned of her great-great-grandfather's part in the First World War.
Very proud, and just to think that he went out into those awful, horrendous places to fight, it's quite touching, really.
That their bravery and sacrifice and the terrible human cost of war will never be forgotten. Martha Fairley, ITV News.
And that is it. I'm back just after 10. Until then, bye-bye.